In this video, we're going to be covering some of the introductory information for the Gospel of Mark. Just a reminder, the four Gospel writers are telling basically the same story of the person and ministry of Jesus, but they all kind of come at it from different angles as they have different purposes for writing and different audiences. And so as we look at Mark, keep in mind that this is all the same story, but with unique perspectives that they each had. Okay, so one interesting thing about the Gospel of Mark is it was believed to be written by John Mark, but he was using Peter, the Apostle Peter, as his material. So Peter was one of Jesus's closest followers, one of his disciples. He was an eyewitness to the life of Jesus. And so John Mark goes on to record what Peter had to say. So we have both mainly external, extra-biblical evidence of John Mark using Peter's testimony for this gospel. We have several quotes from extra-biblical sources, which is like the writings of the early church fathers, that explicitly say John Mark wrote this as a result of Peter. And then there's some internal evidence as well within the book. As with the Gospel of Matthew and the others, there isn't an explicit claim that John Mark is writing this from the perspective of Peter, but we can kind of get some hints that John Mark is writing from Peter's perspective, because Mark includes some passages that seem to be kind of from Peter's point of view. So John Mark was a Jewish Christian, and you will hear more about him in the book of Acts. We see he goes on to go on missionary journeys with Paul, and so he was very much part of the life of the early church and knew the apostles. So the book was most likely written after the death of Peter. So it seems that Mark, after Peter died, kind of wrote down an account of everything Peter had told him. And this was probably in the early 60s AD. So like I said in the Matthew video, Mark is the most likely the first gospel to have been written, the first of the four books. And then Matthew and Luke actually go on and write their gospels after Mark, using some of his material in their gospels. So it's just interesting to note that Mark is doing something that hadn't been done until this point. Until this point, the way that people communicated about the life and ministry of Jesus was through oral tradition, from talking with each other and telling stories. And so Mark does something new by choosing to record this information, to keep it and preserve it. He seems to have mostly been writing to Gentiles. He is writing to a church of a group of suffering Christians, and they are in Rome. And so they were suffering most likely as a result of the persecution of Nero. And Nero was the ruler of Rome in this time. And to say he had it out for Christians was a bit of an understatement. They endured horrible things under the reign of Nero. And so Mark seems to be writing this gospel to them as a way of encouraging them in their walk of faith. Just a few things about Mark's gospel. So it is the shortest gospel. It is only 16 chapters, but it is action-packed. It's like an action movie. From the beginning to the end, it is something big happening, something after the next. And you get a sense of this this action-oriented type narrative, because Mark uses words like immediately a lot. Just keep in mind as you read every time that you see the word immediately. And once I tell you this and you start to look for it, you're going to see that it's just all throughout the book. And it just kind of gives this sense of like things quickly happening one after the other. And so you also see this in his use of present tense verbs. It's just kind of a way of moving the narrative along pretty quickly. And other than that, it's a pretty straightforward read. Another thing about Mark is he records more miracles of Jesus than any of the other gospel writers. And generally, he likes to record the response of the audience. So the response of those that saw Jesus perform a miracle. And he seems to always record that they just marveled at what Jesus had done. There was marvel and amazement. And this doesn't translate really at all in most cases to like an allegiance to Jesus or a true following of him as their Messiah, but people were just shocked and amazed by the things that Jesus was doing. And so Mark records that. And then another thing, there is no birth narrative in Mark. So there is a birth narrative in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, but in Mark, we just hit the ground running. So no birth narrative. Okay, so a couple of themes, or a few themes that Mark wants to show are prominent within his gospel. The first is the term gospel itself. Mark kicks off his gospel by introducing it as this is the beginning of the gospel. And this means good news. This word in Greek is euangelion. And generally, if you've been in Christian circles today, when you hear the word gospel, you may think, oh, that refers to the person Jesus coming and dying for your sins, and you need to respond to that. Well, that's not exactly what Mark has in mind here, because at this point, he's introducing the gospel as good news, and Jesus dying does come, but it's bigger than that. It's something that's not just about the reader and their eternal destination, but it's the good news, the pronouncement that Jesus has come to earth and is doing something here on earth. So just keep that in mind when you hear or when you read good news or gospel in Mark. Don't immediately think of kind of how the term is used today. The next theme is that Jesus is a servant. And Mark kind of highlights that though Jesus is king and is the Messiah that the people were waiting for, he also is coming in an unexpected way as a servant. And so this is kind of this upside down weird thing that Mark shows. Jesus came to save the people, but he did this through suffering. Not just in his death, but also through his ministry of him giving himself for the sake of others. And I think this would have really resonated with Mark's audience because, as I said, they were enduring horrible suffering and persecution and tribulation because they were followers of this Jesus. And so they would have been encouraged by the fact that even though they are going through persecution and hard times, Jesus did too. Jesus suffered and was a servant for all so that he would be able to save all. And then the last theme is just the idea of mystery. So Mark just interestingly paints this picture of Jesus as Messiah, but interwoven into the account is kind of this mystery of who is this Jesus person. You'll see lots of questions throughout the account that say things like, who is this man that is able to do this miracle or is able to do this? And so instead of being maybe more obvious, like Matthew generally is, it's more like this slowly revealed mystery of Jesus's true identity. So these are just some background things just to be keeping in mind as you read through the gospel. You will also have a video that just kind of does a flyby of what Mark talks about in his gospel, and then you will be all set to read the book.